Today we're joined by a good friend and colleague, Paddy Hallinan. Paddy brings lived experience insights from both the ADF and Indo-Pacom planning and preparedness. His career has given him a front row seat to the big shift shaping regional security, from Modi's meeting with Xi and Putin to the Quad's drive on resilient supply chains and the outcomes of the recent Pacific Island Leaders Forum. We'll talk about the readiness of our own forces and population, the bigger question as well. Could Australia and our Pacific friends actually sustain ourselves if a kinetic conflict escalated? Paddy, how are you, mate?
I'm very well, Todd. How are you?
Exceptional, except for that Wallabies result on the weekend just gone. That was a pretty good outcome given the way they played.
Well, that's true. I mean, you can't have everything, they say, but yeah, look, disappointing. They got themselves near, but just not across the line enough times when it was needed. So, look, some interesting calls there. I think both teams would feel a little aggrieved at the stop-start, but not too different than the stop-start going on in the political sphere at the moment.
We're talking here about planning for not what's now, what's next, but what's after that. It seems to be where the government's I guess where they're taking us on this journey. But when people do hear about planning and preparedness, they're often thinking about picture binders on shelves or war games on maps, or blokes with cigars in their mouth pushing things around on tables like little toy ships and whatnot. But what does it actually really look like from someone with your experience and your chair when it comes to this type of planning?
Oh, look, I think from a military planner's perspective, this is not unusual. This concept of having detailed plans put together for for various contingencies, conflicts, and those kinds of things, i.e., the things that the military will be called upon by their governments to provide a response should the government call on it. But I think what's changing at the moment is that we have very much moved to an environment where it is no longer just about the Department of Defence in the Australian instance who should be doing the planning. It is a national effort. The type of scenarios and conflicts that are being sort of touted in the open source media about the People's Republic of China's intentions with respect to how it's behaving, its rapid growth, its intentions in the regions, its intentions to counter US dominance or what was dominance in the Indo-Pacific, and so forth. And given the scope and scale of what that may involve, which could be triggered by something such as a forcible reunification of Taiwan, for example, but not only that, that it is not something that this country has experienced since the 40s. And of course, what that meant was that it required a national effort. So I think for the first time, there's starting to become a realization beyond the Department of Defence that this it requires a national approach, a national effort. Now, the national security or the national defence strategy, etc., talked about whole of government effort, as how government saw the question about security. But of course, that's great, I guess, from a defence perspective, because it has the potential then to encourage cross-level, across departments and so forth, to start to develop concepts for how our nation will need to posture in order to position itself for a conflict of scale when it is directly or otherwise threatened with kinetic or non-kinetic, or lethal or non-lethal effects. And that's defence has but one role, albeit significant, but not the only player in that. So I think, considerations about what that may look like, and therefore how will the country itself mobilise? What will that mean for industry in terms of its contribution? How will the guarantee of supply be maintained or delivered by government? Because that'll be the expectation from the Australian people, regardless of what's going on. Supply will need to continue both for, people's needs, business requirements, and so forth, not only domestically, but certainly for those businesses and big industry, et cetera, which is involved in trade internationally. So there's a lot more. I think conceptually, the idea about planning and preparedness is developing some new meaning for people. Within defence, I don't think it's any different, and I think people would understand why that's not the case. But obviously, it's elevated in thinking a bit more widely beyond that department, and that's understandable. So that's how the environment's looking, and to me, the trigger is an understanding and an acceptance that it is beyond a defence problem. It is a national problem. So how is the government going to get the nation prepared for a conflict of some sort of scale where our homeland, which includes the prosperity of our homeland and its continued, the continuation of the economy and commerce, etc., how are we going to posture and what will we need to do collectively, both in industry and otherwise, to position ourselves as best for that?
And it's interesting, mate, because you and I have recently had some conversations with some very large and important organisations to this country and this country's prosperity, and it seems that they're already trying to do a lot of different planning and scenario testing themselves. But I wonder if that's in silo or in conjunction with the government, as well, or if the government's sort of sitting back going, well, okay, industry, well, good luck. Let's just wait until the fireworks go off to see what actually happens. Or, as you said, as a whole, a national approach. We're talking energy, you're talking health, you're talking about every major input into making society tick.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, the last time we sort of really got to the national defence question, I guess, with the Gillard government. But in truth, until such time as there is a fully mature, endorsed concept for national defence and a plan for national defence, which includes the continuation of the economy, for want of a better term, as well as the protection of critical assets and the like, and everything that conflict brings with it in terms of the application of military power. There's going to be some shortfalls because what do you wrap yourself around collectively that unifies everybody to a single sort of an agreed direction, I guess, for want of a better term? I think to answer your question in part, there's a number of left and right hands going on across the country, in industry, in both public and private sectors and so forth. Everybody is being given plenty to think about in public discourse through media and the like about how they, what the geostrategic circumstances are, and what that may or may not mean to us as a country and to business as a business, depending on what that is, to the people of the country, to the government of the day, and of course to military planners who are always posturing for any eventuality that's likely to require the application of military power. That's its job, and understandably so, and it positions itself as best it can to meet what it believes will be the circumstances that if government calls upon it, it's going to be able to deliver. But there's no... what's missing, of course, is a fully accepted and unified sort of plan that everybody is wrapped around, which is all-encompassing in a national sense. Now, look, it sounds like utopia, and maybe some would suggest that what I'm saying is just not achievable. I don't think that's true. What it would take, of course, is an acceptance by the Australian community and the government writ large that there is genuinely a need to have a national plan of the type that we're sort of talking about in this conversation, and what that involves. At the same time, how that gets managed with the extant pressures that Australians are feeling in terms of cost of living, industries feeling, business, etc. How you can get sufficient attention to prioritise those activities in a planning and preparedness sense, so that the country is as ready as it can be for a conflict of some sort of scale.
Yeah, and that window was shortened as we've been discussing, and we don't have those 5-10 years to plan anymore. And as you rightly say, well, we're already in conflict, be it cyber and other types of warfare. So how does that planning go from discussing the art of the possible to having to actually react and respond and recover almost?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, it'll take the drive from the government. I mean, the government direction, the government resourcing to make this happen, of course, to unify, efforts, and them to be resourced accordingly to get on and do things. So therein, of course, lies the first challenge. Now, we have a strategic circumstance where one would argue that, through COVID, that posture that had been, one of the key sort of policy posture positions, I guess, in Canberra for many years was to never allow ourselves to be forced to choose between our major trading partner, i.e. China, and our major ally, the US. And I think in truth, China forced our hand to make that call and we chose the alliance. But we have a government now whose approach to the alliance and its approach to the major trading partner would arguably suggest that maybe they don't see it exactly the same way. So, there are some pundits out there, of course, who think that no matter what, given the circumstances, the geography situation of Australia, and what that means in terms of a conflict to counter something like China, should the US become involved in a conflict with China in the region at scale, that the US will always be there for us and all the rest of it. Well, I don't know. It has to be tested. There's a lot of things about the administration that we think we know, but have not been actually tested in that sense. And maybe if this $12 billion meeting goes ahead, we might get a better sense about how the Trump administration does view us and what it will require on our part to provide whatever guarantees that we need, that either US won't satisfy or we have concerns that they won't be able to satisfy. Look, I'm not so sure. I think one of the challenges for everybody, both in industry and across the board, is in some respects the mixed signals and communications that the Australian government is sending, both to the domestic Australian audience, and there's a number of challenges there, not the least which driven by some of the divisive sort of environments that that have been created in this country, and there's a lot to deal with there. There's pressures on spending across the board. There's pressures from our alliance partner about how much we believe we are and aren't contributing towards the defence portfolio and the like. But this is all in an environment which some would consider to be uncertain. But for me, last time I looked in the dictionary, there is certainty in the word uncertainty, and the trick is to find that for everybody. It's kind of the risks and opportunities sort of concept under the SWOT sort of analysis piece. There's always risks. I mean, it's easy to identify the risks. The challenge is to find the opportunities that may also be there as well, and those are the ones you want to try and pursue while managing the assessed risks. And I think that's the business that we need to be in at the moment. It's easy to fall over and be consumed by the risks and the uncertainties and all the rest of it, but find the certainties and find the opportunities and see where they can take it at the same time. But, we're talking some big pictures, big dollars, long-term investment requirements here and challenges. But I think a lot of it boils back to the fact, for me, in a national sense, is because it's actually a national question now. So conflicts that the Australian military has been engaged in when sent by the Australian government have been expeditionary in nature, offshore, Middle East and so forth. We haven't been in a situation where we, at scale, have been challenged. Our security has been physically challenged. We've been attacked on the homeland. And we're talking about a concept where already we have in what is an information campaign that's going on day to day at the moment that we find ourselves in, like everyone around the world, where a lot of these effects are being prosecuted through the cyber and space domains. And the truth is, this country can be brought to its knees without a shot being fired kinetically, per se. Because we've already had examples in a number of industries in this country where through the cyber domain we've been impacted. And, the technology is there. We've seen, that technologies like these things employed by the Israelis, for example, to get pages in people's pockets and all these other things exploding. I mean, the reality is that technology exists to touch us, for want of a better term, as a nation. And of course, it wouldn't surprise people to understand or to even think that in a conflict of scale, if it became such in the Indo-Pacific, whether or not it was triggered by an aggressive behaviour of China on the Taiwan reunification question or what, or otherwise, it doesn't really matter. One of the things that will be challenged without doubt is Australia's support for anything that's going on to counter a Chinese manoeuvre or something at scale. And of course, like everything that is in coalitions, one of the weaknesses of a coalition are its seams, and that these coalitions can remain unified. So of course that is targetable. And if there was a scenario that developed where the US and the China were engaged in a major conflict in the region, and the US was seeking support for either flow or force projection from Australia to support its operations and stuff, there is no doubt that Australia is likely or should expect to be targeted in order to force the government's considerations about continued support for the US efforts, etc. And that can come in many forms. And it doesn't necessarily include ballistic missiles, although we know the PRC has those capabilities right now, and those capabilities can extend well into the Australian mainland and provide at least a threat of that nature. Now, that, of course, is scary in itself because of the collateral damage and the scale of the impact of that kind of thing, but it's also the morale impacts and so forth that would occur. And, we just don't have the capacity on our own to deal with that. But this is what the government of the day, quite rightly, should be charged with, is understanding and accepting that and positioning and posturing the country as a whole, not just the Defence Force, but as a whole, in order to prepare ourselves for that contingency should it arise.
Yeah. And mate, you mentioned a few things there that really are triggering my thoughts. One, it's a national effort. Two, we have an alliance with a partner. It's a long-standing alliance, obviously different to a trade partner. And you talk about coalition planning. You've been involved in not only ADF planning but Indo-PACOM planning, other types of planning offshore and other theatres as well. What's the big difference, or how involved will, I guess, the US, their capabilities and abilities, how do they tie into our planning from a national response? Is there much consideration given to that?
Yeah, look, of course there is, and I think you would expect that too. I mean, for me, one of the keys for combined coalition planning is the fundamental point of alignment, right? The risk to any coalition in any sense is misalignment. And I mean that in a tier 0, tier 1 sort of strategic or operational sense. Somehow or another, it's how you preserve your national sovereignty and your priorities to preserve the importance and the objectives of your own nation, but how you can manage those when you are combined with an ally or a coalition partner. Now, that's no different politically to try and achieve those things where there may be some diversification on views. Now, the Taiwan piece is a case in point. There are different drivers for US policy positions and Australian policy positions about the Taiwan question. And they're known, they're open, not the least of which the US has a treaty obligation. But the fact is, how politically will those differences be managed to ensure alignment if we decide politically to join forces to counter a PRC aggressive move or something at some scale or whatever? And then likewise, from a military planning perspective, if there is the direction from governments to commit military capabilities into an alliance, to a coalition force, a combined force, then it's up to the planners to ensure that the preservation of the government of the day's rights to make its own decisions and stuff are maintained. But where alignment can best be achieved, and that includes where capabilities can be shared, where interoperability becomes really critical in order to deliver the most powerful effect that is representative of the governments of the day directions with respect to that particular conflict. And for me, when I'm working with, and talking to planners and stuff, in the coalition sense, I often talk to them about this, is that always be looking, as I say, always be looking for the misalignment, because that's the thing that's going to bring it undone, but that's a vulnerability that potentially an adversary would seek to target. But, that's no less important than it's always been, but certainly I think it has importance now because this is not a discussion that people think for a contingency that for many years we thought was decades down the road or, at least 5 years down the road. All our strategic assessments, and not only our own, but of other nations across the globe, suggest that there is a higher degree of risk of a conflict of some scale in the region, much closer than we think. And in truth, that should not be a surprise to most people. I mean, if nothing else, Xi has not been backward in coming forward about his intentions. And he, arguably through both the national conferences, but also through, the party in Beijing the other week, quite frankly, made it very clear of not only that, but more importantly, reinforce the message, which should be of concern to the West, is, not are there some potential nasty sort of stakeholders out there, which we all knew, but what's becoming more apparent is how closely they're working together now. And that's disturbing. And the truth for me is that Xi is on a time clock. Now there's a lot going on at the moment. There's a fundamental shift of the US, out of NATO, out of Europe. There's some questions about what the US administration really means in terms of how much it repostures towards Indo-Pacific and how much towards what it describes as the sort of the homeland part of the North and South America, etc. So that presents some ticking a time clock thought construct, I guess, about what that means and about whether or not the US is balanced or unbalanced at the moment while that sort of change is occurring. It's about respective capabilities that preside for the PRC at the moment. So it's a calculated decision, of course, that needs to be made. And at the end of the day, if you're a pundit or an analyst who believes that Xi believes that the legacy that he wants to leave is the reunification of the Taiwan piece as his piece and the modernisation and growth of China's power, then it'd be hard to argue that it could happen any time. I mean, there's many pundits out there who suggested that the whistle for kickoff might come somewhere in the next couple of years. And the truth is, around the world, in the West, and certainly in the region, the challenge for everybody, both governments and military forces, is to be as match fit as possible, should that be the case. So if in 2 years' time, Xi blows the whistle and there's a requirement for us to engage into a conflict, have we given ourselves every opportunity, both politically and militarily, to prepare ourselves to be as match fit as possible for that kickoff?
Yeah.
And what that represents, of course, is an opportunity, and this is that point about risks and opportunities. Yes, that's a risk, but that becomes a guardrail or a beacon that potentially you can hold to become a forcing function to do things, to take actions, to invest accordingly, for businesses to consider certain strategies tied around that because that's a tangible goal or a marker in the sand. And of course, if something doesn't eventuate, but in many instances, we spend half our lives planning for a contingency that we don't necessarily have the confidence about when that could occur.
Mm.
I think one of the things we're faced with at the moment is a very real possibility or the prospect that there is actually something we could, with some degree of confidence, potentially put a marker down, in terms of time. And that then forces people to go, well, like it's not like we could think it could happen sometime. We actually think it could happen in this time frame. And hopefully that will be something to encourage the engagement and so forth, and then drive the planning and preparedness pieces that are required in order to posture for that.
Yeah. And Paddy, both sides are obviously, picking their teams at the moment. So we've seen obviously Xi and Putin that, they're always been quite warm along with, their little bloke from the north of the peninsula there. For me, it was a shock, but we saw, Indian Prime Minister Modi at this same soiree. I was quite shocked. I mean, you talk about alliances and you talk about coalitions and planning. Like, we've had the Quad in place, and Howard brought it back when he came back in. You and I have had a bit to do with it over the last few years, you specifically, with a whole lot of planning. Um, I was of the opinion that the Japanese, the Australians, the US, and the Indians were all finally aligned on security needs. And then when you see Prime Minister Modi turning up, but mate, is this? I just don't know. I didn't. Why is he there? Like, everyone seemed to be blindsided. Was it a diplomatic blip, or is it something that we think should fundamentally shape how we're now thinking about regional security?
I think it's interesting. I mean, we're sort of joking a little bit about it, but it's pretty serious, of course. I mean, you could argue there was a little alarming what happened there. I mean, like the fallout between Modi and Trump is a little bit of a concern, but at the moment it's just spat until we realise whether or not it's got any legs to last, and how deep the resentment becomes and what that means in terms of policy and decisions that those two national leaders make. But that probably drove in the short term that behaviour from Modi. But, at the end of the day, part of it too is, you know, Modi is driven by a desire, in my view, the Indian government to satisfy the population. So there's a need. It's trying to meet there. Um, so you could almost argue that the contention that the difference between the Indians and the Chinese is the Indians are driven by a need to satisfy a populous country and all its needs and all the rest of it. The PRC, arguably, or the CCP, is driving something not only to satisfy the domestic need, but to quell the population and control things. But at the end of the day, it's also to satisfy an ambition for dominance. Now, that's fundamentally the difference between the two. Now, in the security dialogue, which is essentially what Quad is really, or how it was born, I mean, you and I have said this before. If we sat in a syndicate room in some college or some fantastic university or whatever and produced that as a solution and said, here you go, how about we put Australians, US, Japanese, and Indians together, and put them in a bar, we'd be told, okay, go back, you two, and do something sensible.
It's a bit of a joke,
Yeah.
is it? You just need an Irish and Englishman in there as well.
Yeah. But I mean, one of the things Quad had, or still does to a degree, I mean, to me, it does represent a potential counterbalance to the PRC question. Um, but, I think it's too early to start becoming alarmist about what Modi's behaviour and actions and things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. But I think it does signal, if nothing else, just how critically important the Quad can be in order to counter PRC ambitions, behaviours, actions and stuff in the region. And then, of course, what does that mean? Because, look, if nothing else from a security perspective, that's one thing, but what does it mean from a trade perspective? So there's big stakeholders in a trade sense in our country who would be and quite obviously very interested in how this is all going to pan out, what opportunities the Indian market represents. I mean, at the moment, 40% of our iron ore is going to the Chinese. So, and this talks to what the nature of a conflict might look like, in our region. And this is where the Australian public, needs to start becoming aware, educated, and so forth to understand that in a conflict of scale that we're talking about, the potential there, one of the key requirements will be the guarantee of supply. And the question will be, how is government going to guarantee supply to its own nation, in this case Australia, the Australian government? How is it going to guarantee supply potentially to other nations in the region in order to maintain support, allegiances, coalitions, if that's the case, and so forth? What does it mean for businesses if, those businesses, and particularly those at scale, who are in the business of trading with China, if there is a decision to control commodities and trade stuff to go into China? So what it means to those businesses, those industries is significant. So the question is, how well engaged are those industries and businesses with governments thinking, etc., about those possibilities, what conflict it may look like, what it might mean, and therefore helping seaboards and so forth determine how best to posture for those types of contingencies. That's the million-dollar question, because it goes back to the point I made earlier that, this will not be if we're talking about a scenario where the entire country is basically engaged in a conflict, where there's a national effort. Yes, there's a military commitment, etc., but it will be either at home or very close to home. Industries across the board, because of the nature of technology and through respective domains like cyber, etc., will be impacted. Our economy, our guarantees of supply will be challenged, not the least of which because there'll be pressure on the Australian government to continue to remain engaged and or supportive of the conflict of the day, etc. There's all that. These are fundamentally the different circumstances I think we find ourselves in. So it's not meant to be alarmist. It's meant to be realistic. Um, there's enough conjecture out there about how certain people would behave and would respond and all the rest of it. But I think at the end of the day, it would be difficult to challenge the prudency of actually being better prepared in a whole of nation sense than we have been, and in fairness, because that pressure geostrategically has not necessarily been sufficiently there, but it's hard to argue it now. I think,
Yeah,
very hard to argue.
times have changed, and like you said, our biggest or key discriminator has always been geography. But as you mentioned earlier, we now know that God forbid, but ballistic missiles can easily reach Sydney and further afield, and you'd hope it never came to that. But you're talking about vulnerabilities there as well, mate. I'd like to dig into that a little bit deeper. So it's not just iron ore, obviously, that we export to China, funnily enough. But gas, we've got an agreement with the Japanese for LNG, and South Korea. Very, very important for those countries to maintain gas supply. They've invested a lot of money in this country. We make a lot of money out of that as well. It's not all about money, but when we're talking about some choke points, we're talking about energy and logistics. And in this particular point, if you had to put your finger on 2 or 3 choke points on energy and logistics supply chain that keep you up at night, what are they?